Good afternoon. Thank you for tuning in today's virtual town hall hosted by the Center for Business and Economic Research. I'm Keith Rogers, the Interim Vice President for Student Affairs at UNLV, and I will moderate the discussion between Andrew Woods and Dr. Stephen Miller, both from CBR. Andrew is the center's director, and Dr. Miller is the former director and now research director. Today's During today's conversation, we will talk about the economy and answer questions submitted ahead of time about a variety of topics, including employment and workforce, infrastructure, tourism, cost of living, and the national economic outlook. But first, let's get started by talking about CBR's population forecast. Andrew, can you tell us what this report is and why it matters?
Of course. Well, thank you, Keith. Thank you for moderating. Thank you to our audience for tuning in today. So the population forecast that Center for Business and Economic Research produced today or produced this year, we've been doing actually for 26 years. Take a look at this slide. We'll show you. So this is a forecast from 2001 for Southern Nevada's population. And as you can see, it forecasted in 2022, we would have 2.336 million people. So 2,336,000,000 people. We actually, as of today, when we forecast, have about 2,333,000 people living in Southern Nevada. So you can see that from 20 years ago, we were forecasting the population. You can see how accurate it was in the last 20 years. So why does this matter? Why does the population forecast matter? Well, this is a planning tool. And we've been doing this again for 26 years. And we do this on behalf of the Southern Nevada Water Authority. We do it on behalf of Clark County, as well as the Regional Transit Commission here in Southern Nevada. And it's used planning for water conservation, for schools, for jobs, for affordable housing, for transportation, public safety, parks. That's why it matters. And as a tool, it's only as useful as much as we use it. And so for us, the purpose of today's town hall is obviously to answer questions about the economy, but also to talk a little bit about this report that we do every year and what it means for Southern Nevada. So as I mentioned, we have a new version of the population forecast that we're going to show here. And you can see that essentially we're forecasting in the next 20 years, 700,000 more people living in Southern Nevada. So by 2040, so 18 years from now, 700,000 more people. Right now, about 3/4, or so for 3 people out of every 4 in the state of Nevada live in Clark County. We forecast that by 2040, it will be every 4 people out of 5. So 80% of the population will be in Southern Nevada. And that's what our current forecast. If you go out longer, it shows actually about 1 million people will live here. Additional people will be living here. But I think it's really important to focus more on the next 20 years because that is, as the adage goes, when's the best time to plant a tree? Yesterday. What's the second best time? Today. And so having these conversations about what it means for our community to have 700,000 more people in the next 20 years and what does that look for Southern Nevada?
So Andrew, let me jump in and,
Yeah.
and say I was walking down the hall this week, and when the press release came out, and a fellow said to me, "You guys are predicting another million people in Las Vegas. You got to be kidding." So let's look at the history. Go back and look at some facts of the past. In the 80s and 90s, we added a million people in Las Vegas. In the next 20 years, we added 900,000 people. So adding a million people in the next 40 years is not outrageous, or 700,000 in the next 20 years is really not outrageous. But it does focus our attention because the population growth presents some challenges, both in terms of land use, water use, and other factors that we're interested in the valley.
Thank you, Andrew and Dr. Miller, for sharing about CBR's population forecast. This segues nicely into the next part of today's conversation as we answer questions submitted over the past few weeks and also those that may rise from me being a novice. Also, for our viewers watching live, please feel free to add your questions in the chat and we will do our best to get to them during today's conversation. Now, I know you mentioned about the projected growth over the next 40 years. Now, how do these numbers compare to national numbers or other cities that we maybe view ourselves as that we aspire to grow to be similar?
Sure, I'll take a crack at this. So the American Southwest is a very popular place to live and has been since air conditioning was invented in the 1950s. And so we're growing, but so is Phoenix, so is Salt Lake, so are other parts of the American Southwest. And a lot of this is being driven by what we call economic migrants coming from Southern California, as well as other parts of the country that want to move into the Sun Belt or the American Southwest. And so we're seeing that tremendous growth, but so is the American Southwest. We've outpaced the national growth, and that gives us some advantages compared to the rest of the country, as people saw in the 2020 census. The country as a whole is slowing in the amount of growth, but in certain parts of the country, like Southern Nevada or Nevada as a whole, we're still very much growing, as we can see here from our population forecast. And so with that comes opportunities, but also comes a lot of challenges.
Well, it is the case that we've been growing pretty rapidly compared to other parts of the country. But if you look at the long term, our forecast is in the out years, the population growth rate attenuates and we move towards the national average. As with anything in economic growth, as the base gets larger, the growth rate is harder to sustain. So we think about China, and they used to grow at double digits because they were a very small economy, but their economy has now grown very large. And to maintain that same rate of growth it's impossible. So as we get larger, it's harder for us to maintain the same growth rate. So we're going to be slowing down as we move into the future.
And I'll just add, though, I think, though, for the time being, the American Southwest will continue to be it seems like a popular place to live and reside in this country.
Now, what does this growth mean for people in Southern Nevada?
Well, it creates an opportunity and it also creates some challenges. So let me talk about the opportunity first. For many years, maybe even decades, the policymakers in Nevada and in Southern Nevada have talked about diversifying the economy. And when you diversify an economy, the question is the size of the pie. Is it static? And if it's static and you try to increase the size of one sector, you're going to have to diminish the size of the other sector. And we know in Southern Nevada, the elephant in the room is leisure and hospitality, and we don't want to put constraints on that industry. That's been our bread and butter for many decades. So that industry is going to continue to grow. The question is, will it grow at a rate maybe some other sectors might grow? So because we're expected to grow over time, we can see other sectors growing more rapidly and becoming a larger share, thus diversifying the economy to some extent relative to our current position, even though the leisure and hospitality sector is still growing.
Stephen, could you speak to some of those projected or faster growing sectors that would contribute to diversifying the economy?
Well, we see retail, transportation, warehousing, those sectors. Now we sit in an ideal location here in the valley, in terms of the Southwest, as being a point where a lot of transportation traffic can meet or cross and stop and go on. The problem is the challenges we have, which I didn't get to, are the infrastructure that sort of act as a constraint or a choke point on transportation in Southern Nevada. So we have I-15 going south to LA. We know the problems there. Going north into Utah, driving there is a bit of a challenge. We also know that we don't have the completed interstate yet, I-11 to Phoenix. So and then we have the possibility of high-speed rail going into Southern California. And then there's also discussion, or has been discussion off and on. It was pretty serious for a while, and then the recession came along. It's now starting to ramp up again about an airport down in Ivanpah.
And I do want to mention, so for our audience, if you go on our website, cber.unlv.edu, you can read the full report. Something we want to point out is that we don't just project the population, but to get that, we have to look at the different economic clusters. And so as Dr. Miller or Steve mentioned, that essentially there is things like transportation and warehousing. Another one I want to bring up that we see significant growth happening is healthcare. We're forecasting that the amount of healthcare workers that we're going to need in Southern Nevada is going to be triple of what it is today. And that is being driven by an aging population right now, because that's based on the data we know, but it also presents a huge opportunity for us to diversify our economy. And as Steve mentioned about the pie. We see the pie growing, but those slices, if we do nothing and just go off what we know of today, the slices will change. And so things like healthcare are going to grow from 10% of our GDP to 14% of our GDP, even while leisure and hospitality is growing as well. And it's going to be the second largest employer in terms of as a economic cluster in our state by 2025. Healthcare is surpassing retail trade, which is a tremendous amount of change and shift of how our economy is changing as we grow.
And then as we sort of assess retail, does your report take into account maybe the impact of online purchasing?
It looks at, and Steve, you can correct me on this, but it looks at basically the trends that we've been seeing over the last, say, 10 years and up to date, the most current data that we have when we run the model. And again, we update it every year. So it does take, I would imagine it's looking at what's been done in the past to predict the future. And so it looks at the trend in online and that shift. Same time, it looks at the trend of more transportation and warehousing here in Southern Nevada because we've got a lot of goods moving through, either coming here or moving through here, as Steve mentioned. And that's a place that we're growing in employment.
Yeah, if you're going more online, and we are seeing that in the data, then you need the warehousing component. So retail may be redefined in terms of the national bean counters when they define the sectors. They may actually redefine what they mean by retail to consider what's going on in warehousing.
Now, we have several audience members have asked the question, what does this mean for housing and jobs?
Well, clearly population growth means you need more housing. And of course, you're not going to see the population grow without more jobs, because as the population grows, they require services. We talked about healthcare. There are other services that people need. And in particular, in this community, a lot of the jobs will be associated with the leisure and hospitality sector. Of course, the whole job market in the United States, and including in Southern Nevada, is undergoing a restructuring at the moment. As people have taken some time off to think about during the pandemic, when they were furloughed or laid off, they had some time to think about, is this what I want? Do I want to go back to the job I was in? Do I want to continue down this path, or do I want to change my occupation, move in different sector? So we're seeing that restructuring taking place, and I don't think that leisure and hospitality is going to have the same demand on labor in the valley that they did in the past, because they're going to automate some of the services that can be automated.
Well, getting back to housing as well is we are land constrained, and that is putting some upward pressure, as we've been seeing recently. Of course, also we know that building permits are going down at the moment. We know that mortgages are going up and prices continue to go higher. And compared to other cities around us, we're still very much affordable. And if you want to know where housing prices are going in Southern Nevada, I say look at what's going on in California and whether their prices are still going up or going down, and that influences out here. I know a friend of mine, John Restrepo's, put out a report on land and the amount of available land for development, and it's a bit scary, that number of how much available land. I think regardless if there's been a lot of talk about a Clark County lands bill out there, and that might ease some of that pressure, but not all of it if you've got 700,000 more people and the amount of units that you would in theory need either for single or multifamily. I think also we have to think about just how we use land in Southern Nevada, the current land that we have. And is there better uses for it? I mean, we've seen things like Texas Stations is no longer reopening, it's being demolished and used for another purpose. Are there some of these projects out there that we could think about? How do we have a more affordable housing and with not regardless if we get more land to build single family houses, but also think about affordable housing and those policies. But again, we're just here to kind of present the data and give that to the policymakers, give that to the private industry, give that to the public to make those decisions and really start thinking about what the future looks like. What kind of community do we want to be based on what we know and what we're forecasting, and plan for that. Because I think intention really matters if we want to make a difference, say, in affordable housing, and having those conversations now instead of 20 years from now.
So along with this, the market is going to determine that outcome in terms of housing. So if you're land constrained, what happens is you'll start going up and you'll see high-rise buildings, so apartments and condos and we actually went through a phase of that in Las Vegas just before the Great Recession, when we started seeing these high-rise going up. And unfortunately, the recession hit and boom, that was the bloom was off the rose in that case, and a lot of these high rises were sort of sitting half done or uncompleted, and or those that were completed had HOA fees that were astronomical that didn't make sense in the new economic environment. Anyway,
I think the key there is affordable housing, right? And
Yeah.
how do we allow the folks that are moving here to be able to afford a quality life in a home?
And definitely, I want to put a pin to return to that
Okay.
point. But I do want to transition, as you talked about employment and diversifying the economy and the workforce. And we have a few audience members that are curious about what about the demographics and age?
So the report tells us essentially that as a whole here in Southern Nevada, over the long run, we're going to age. So is the rest of the country, though we are in a better position than the rest of the country. We still have a younger overall workforce here in Southern Nevada. But the number of 65 plus people living in or residing in Southern Nevada is going to double, at least according to our forecast, in the coming decades. And that puts a big stress on things like healthcare, because we're going to need more home health aides. We're going to need about triple the amount of home health aides, and we're going to need double the amount of in and out patient care services. But that leaves us also with a huge opportunity to diversify, because some of those jobs, like for every physician we create and they start a practice, comes 15 direct and indirect jobs from that don't require an MD, but other types of skills. Or if we want to get into the research side and talk about research around aging and some of those, whether you're talking about pharmaceuticals or you're talking about new studies and research, those kind of jobs, for every researcher creates about 3.5 other jobs that don't require, say, a PhD. Sometimes they only require an associate's degree. So workforce training and workforce is going to be really key as the demographic shift. In terms of what our report is saying for growth in terms of race and ethnicity, it's, as you can see on the charts that we've put up, and this is on our website at cber.unlv.edu. The amount, as we add, say, another 1 million people, the majority of that is going to come, say, from the Hispanic community, and it also means that as a community, we're going to continue to diversify as a demographic. And that's a strength, right? That's a real opportunity for us to think about how we're doing workforce training, quality of life, helping get more people to come to be first generation college students, like here at UNLV. And we're basically the face of the nation and where the nation is headed. So let's start putting in place, thinking about policies and programs to help give everyone an equal chance at a good life.
And Steve, do you have anything to add to that?
well, just maybe on the chart, just so the audience is clear on this. So the chart is telling us if population increases by 1 million, then 60% of that is going to be Hispanic, if I'm looking at ethnicity.
That's right.
And on the age side, 48% of that will be over 65 plus.
Yep.
So 650,000 I'm sorry, 40, my apologies, 482,000 over 65, and it'd be 602,000 Hispanics added to the population.
And then how does this compare to sort of national demographic and age information? And I know you mentioned, Andrew, that we are sort of the maybe sort of a lead for what the rest of the country can expect. Could you make that correlation for the audience?
Sure, that's a great question. So we're leading the nation in terms of diversifying the demographics as we here in Southern Nevada, with Hispanics, with African Americans, with Asian Americans, et cetera. Where the country is going to be in about 40 years, we're already ahead of that curve. In terms of aging, though, we're a little bit younger still in the rest of the country. So even though we're expecting more than double the amount of individuals 65 plus living in Southern Nevada, we're still going to have a younger workforce overall compared to the rest of the country. But as time goes on, as I think Dr. Miller or Steve's going to say here, is as time goes on, those will start to average out. So the country will start to catch up with us, and we'll start to catch up the country when we're talking about demographics and age.
And then the next question, how will automation and remote work affect future jobs in Southern Nevada?
Well, we've lived through the pandemic, and we know that we could divide the economy into two sectors, those that required face-to-face economic conversations and those that didn't require face-to-face. And the non-face-to-face sectors did much better because they didn't have to shut down. But the face-to-face sectors had to shut down. The governor imposed, the casino shut down, and we had various sectors not operating. So people who were in the one sector were laid off. Were, as I said earlier, they were looking for maybe switching jobs, and the government stepped in and provided additional unemployment support. The first offer was $600 a week, and I always like to say that $600 a week, if you work 40 hours a week, that's $15 an hour. That's sort of like at the minimum wage. Most people are sort of talking about what they'd like to have for the country. That was on top of any unemployment they already were receiving. So, and people are not stupid. They realize that the pandemic had a serious effect on the economy, and they saved a lot of that. They didn't spend it. And what we're seeing as we came out of the pandemic is the consumer spending held up. It's still holding up today. I know later we're going to talk about the possibility of recession, but consumer spending hasn't been held up because of the saving that was stocked away during the time of the pandemic.
Well, and I think from our data and how we compute the population forecast, you can see it where automation has impacted. So I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Steve, but I remember looking at 10, 20 years ago, for every casino job, especially around a hotel room, it created about 2 workers in a gaming facility. Today, it's closer to 1. And it's still much higher compared to a non-gaming facility. So that is why our resorts are such a driver for employment, and they're really critical for our economy, and we want them to continue to grow. But you can see automation is playing in the numbers of the amount of jobs per room that are being created, and how that has decreased over time because of new technologies, because of new efficiencies, because they've learned how to, that the pandemic, helped them learn that maybe we don't want our room cleaned every day. Maybe it's every other day, and that in itself shifts the amount of workers that you need.
And I know you talked about the types of jobs and within sort of a future that's a more diverse economy within the state, in particular Clark County. The types of jobs that you talk about, what are some of the, if you look at salaries of those types of jobs, like are we creating more high skill jobs, low skill jobs? Is education required, or what level of education attainment is required for these different jobs that could come with a more diverse economy?
That is a great question. So, and that's where I think the whole point of the population forecast is in getting this out into the public to have that conversation. So, when we look at the data, we're going to need a lot more home health aides, right? But those kind of jobs maybe pay $20 an hour. If we talk about ambulatory care, so in outpatient care, so that you can go and see a doctor and get a, say, broken bone fixed without having to go to the hospital, there's 15 jobs around that one physician, and they don't all require an MD or even a nursing or any of that. Sometimes they just require an associate's degree or some sort of training. If we talk about manufacturing, for something that CBER has been really talking about lately is the lithium ion industry or the hydrogen industry, because we have this clean energy transition happening. A lot of those jobs, yeah, you need PhDs, but sometimes you just need certain certificates or just working in the industry for 6 months to go out and how to actually put together batteries, or even to do some of the research, or to go work in the mining industry or the recycling industry, which are all going to be needed in something that Southern Nevada can help diversify. So I think it's all about, if we look at the data today, a lot of those jobs may not require very much education, but if we make some of the decisions and have some intention behind where we want this to go and how we diversify our economy, yeah, we're still going to need some PhDs and master's and bachelor's degrees, but there's a lot of jobs out there that just need training. And if we can get them trained, they can make, instead of $15 an hour, they might be making, $40 an hour, depending on the industries. For example, again, lithium ion industry, some of these entry level jobs pay as much as you would make on the strip, but you need about 6 months of training. And so we have to be kind of intentional about where we drive that economy. And I know Steve likes to say it's also going to be driven by the private sector, and we need to work with them on like their needs and letting them kind of drive, like, here are the type of workers that we need. But I know having those conversations today, especially if we're talking about healthcare or manufacturing, you don't necessarily need, they do need PhDs and they need bachelor's degrees, but they also need as many, if not more, folks that just have some sort of training and understanding of the industry and what they're doing.
We have a shortage of workers in traditional trades, which pay very well. And the problem is that sort of the younger people don't view the trades as a career. And so in some sense, there's an information issue, problem of not knowing, or thinking that, well, I don't want to get my hands dirty. I want a white collar job rather than a blue collar job, when the blue collar job may pay more than a white collar job.
And keep them employed longer, which is for us, at CBER, we're always thinking about the next bend in the road, whether it's a recession or Kool-Aid. And so our goal is we're looking through our research and providing this to the public is how do we help our decision makers, avoid some of these impacts of the next recession? Because it's not a question of if, but when, so that we don't have a third of our workforce unemployed or even a sixth of our workforce unemployed. That's not healthy for an economy, and that's not normal, except in Southern Nevada.
And I know you mentioned, like the workforce and diversifying the economy, it's hard to talk about those things without talking about the infrastructure that's
Yeah.
necessary to support these growth projections that you talk about. So one of the things we were just talking about education, and sort of what is the role that you see K-20 playing in this space?
Well, I came to Las Vegas in 2001 and I was amazed because we were growing so fast that we built one new public school every year. Was it 12 new public
Yeah,
schools
yeah,
every year? I think it was 12 public
yeah.
schools every year. But the necessary requirement for education is to have the buildings, but that's the least of our worries. Our main concern should be the teachers and the delivery of knowledge and skills. Our employers are looking for employees that have the necessary skills to meet the needs of their jobs. And particularly for those companies that may be thinking about locating from Southern California to Nevada or from any state into Nevada, the question is, what is the school system like? Because not only do they're interested in their employees, what skills do my employees have? They're also interested in their children, where my kids are going to go to school. And we know that for decades we've wrestled with this issue about how we provide a quality education. We know that within the Clark County School District there are some excellent schools, and we get excellent training for a lot of kids in the county. But that's not necessarily always the case, and we have other schools that need assistance.
And I can say from the data in the report, which again, cber.unlv.edu, we have the full report up there as well as a summary for folks to read. But in the appendix, we do talk about the we show how many teachers, for example, or just people in the education sector are going to be in demand. The thing that's a little worrisome is not only about the future growth of those teachers, but right now we have a shortage of teachers and attracting them here, and how does that impact education going forward? I can tell you, we look at case examples like Phoenix or Salt Lake who made investments in education 20, 30 years ago, and it's paying off today because they're recruiting high-tech companies, they're recruiting chip makers, car companies, defense companies that are in high-tech sectors. They have the same issues that we have when it comes to limits on growth, water, infrastructure, and yet they are growing rapidly and bringing new employers because they made those investments decades ago in education. I said it earlier, when's the best time to plant a tree? Yesterday. What's the second best time? Today. If we make those decisions today, they're going to pay off in the long run for us as we have 700,000 more people, and hopefully they have jobs that allow them to be successful through their careers, and that next time there's a recession, not all, a third of our workforce is unemployed.
And you make two great points in terms of the importance of the quality of education, and in terms of industries making decisions to
Yes.
move their workforce here to ensure that it is a high quality of life here, and that their kids and dependents can get those quality education to get good jobs. So what advice or guidance would you recommend to decision makers in the sort of education space, and how they can utilize this report and this data to help inform how they view the critical importance of education, and how they look to reallocate resources into infrastructure around buildings, teachers, etc.?
It's a hard question because we're just economists crunching numbers, right? And not in necessarily on the front lines.
I'm okay if you punt it.
No, I'd say that the key is that we're predicting the number of seats, and so we can give some information about the number of schools that we need. That implies therefore the number of computers, so on and so forth, but it doesn't speak directly to the quality of the education.
And I think it's really important that, when you look at these numbers, if we're going to have 700,000 more people, that means that time is the essence. So we need to have an honest conversation about what education means and delivers in this state. And that's, I understand, a very tough conversation. And that's, again, it's easy for us to sit in our, around crunching numbers and not necessarily be on the front lines like so many others in this community. But at the same time, someone needs to step up and say, this is, we've got to change this and we've got to do a better job.
And it's hard to talk about infrastructure without talking about water. But that's so, especially since it's in the national news, and so lots of our audience members are asking about water. So, what happens when there are 700,000 or more residents in Southern Nevada by 2024? So, what is the sort of plan to transition or scale up to that increase in population?
Well, our forecast is partly to fill the needs of the Southern Nevada Water Authority. So they've been on board with us from almost the very beginning, maybe from the beginning. So there's been a lot of planning, a lot of thought. They've not been sitting around just drinking coffee. They've been out very busy trying to figure out how to conserve water. So since 2002 till today, total water usage in Southern Nevada, that's total, not per capita, total water usage has fallen by about 23, 24, 25%. That's an amazing record of conservation. And that effort to conserve water is continuing, so that we've had 2 emergencies declared and we've had cuts in our water allocation, but it didn't affect us because we were not using our limit. We were well below that, so that at least at the moment, things are pretty good in terms of the problem. I think is the other states, and in particular California. We have an issue because they're out, like, they take a lot of water, and a lot of their water goes into agriculture.
And I would just add to that. So as Steve mentioned, it's reduced by 26%, even though we've added something like 750,000 people in the last 20 years. We built into our model is an assumption that as a planning tool, they will continue to make policy or come up with technologies to conserve water here in Southern Nevada. So there is an underlying assumption that as we move forward, the Water Authority is doing what they need to do to conserve water, and there will be water here for residential or consumption for people living here or visiting here. Obviously, the future is unpredictable, but at the same time, that assumption is built in, and we've seen, again, past this prologue, that in the past they have been able to do that. And I know they're using this as a planning tool to think about what needs to continue to happen in place so that we have water here. And as Steve mentioned, 80% of the water on the Colorado River is used for agriculture, not human consumption. And that's a whole nother conversation that is certainly far beyond our wheelhouse of what we work on a day-to-day basis. But we know that by continuing to provide this information to the Water Authority, that they have the best information available to them to make the decisions going forward. And you see that, right? There's going to be non-decorative grass. There's going to be a limit on size of the pools. They're working on which is a tough conversation, but on the evaporative coolers. I think their assumption is that they are able to get these policies in place, and then there's new technologies that happen or sources or whatever they decide and arrange, that the water then is still here. Because we get the question every time we do this is, well, how are we going to grow if we don't have any water? I think the assumption is we will have water, but it may look, how we consume it, how we use it, how we conserve it, maybe look different 20 years from now as it looked different 20 years ago.
And then for our audience, could you maybe clarify what % of the water is allocated for Nevada?
It's only like 2%. Yeah, it's very low. I mean, of the total allocation.
That's when the contract was originally set. I mean, Las Vegas was very small.
Yeah,
correct.
So we didn't get very much in the bargain.
Mm-hmm. And I think you made an important point that 80% of the water goes toward agriculture, mm-hmm. and only 20% of it goes toward human consumption. I think that's a piece that most people don't quite mm-hmm. understand. So I think that was a great point to make. Additionally, how does this report influence what we do about land, electricity, roads?
Well, it affects all of those items. If you have more population, as we see in life, if you've lived in Las Vegas for any length of time, the orange cones are our friends, right? Our enemies. Yeah. So road construction continues, and we've already talked about land. And my view is that land will take care of itself. You may disagree with that, but, I don't think we have a shortage of land. It's at what price does your land sell? Um, what would you like to add to the conversation?
Well, going back, maybe not just focusing on land, but I think about infrastructure, for example, or transportation, right? If we're going to have more visitors here, we're going to have more people residing here. We got to think about what can we be doing today, build infrastructure that accommodates everyone to be able to get to their job, but also the changes of what a job means, because not everyone goes in the office every day these days. How do we get visitors to and from from the strip or from downtown or from our leisure and hospitality resorts? And that's a long-term thinking. One of the things that we have worked on and talked a lot about is complete streets and how you build neighborhoods around those and how those actually improve quality of life and housing and income opportunities, because you're doing something first and foremost on transportation and infrastructure, but not just simply building concrete, but making it safe for all mobility, which means walking, bicycles, scooters, bus traffic. And yeah, one day we're gonna have to really get serious about what other than driving a car or a bicycle or a scooter is a form of transportation. We need to have those conversations about a real infrastructure network like light rail, which I know is not easy, but we're growing and other cities are figuring this out. I mean, Portland, Phoenix, Salt Lake, all of them have figured this out. LA now, and the longer we wait, the more expensive it gets, which is why this is such a great planning tool to have those conversations today and not 20 years from now.
And then I know for most of us who drive to work, some of us have had to return to work post-COVID.
Yeah.
So, and you see that there's just a tremendous amount of construction going on the roads and to the Spaghetti Bowl and different parts to really build out the 215, expanding the 15 and egress regress. So could you talk a little bit about how this type of report influences the current planning of that, and what's the lag between the data that they're using to predict road work versus where we should be to plan for 2020, 2040?
I mean, I'll leave it to RTC people can ask them how exactly they use this, but we know in conversations with them, right? This goes into a lot of their different planning models of what needs to be done as we grow and where we're going and what does that actually mean, and then put it into traffic volume models about how traffic demand on different roads is going to change. The same with pedestrian walking and all that. As you have 700,000 more people, that's influencing those models. I can't say with specificity what they're exactly using for and leave that to them. But I think other thing that we didn't mention too is just like public safety, for example. This also, I have talked to the county about this, and they use this to think about how many more cops we're going to need, how many more firefighters we're going to need, what all that equipment, what about all the long run, as you have more workers, you also got to think about retirement and pay and all those things. And so they build that into this model. And this is like if you're baking a cake, this isn't the only ingredient, but this is one of the main ingredients that goes into those forecasts.
And Steve, do you have anything to add?
No, I'm good.
And then, as we talk about transportation, how do we move people from point A to point B? I think that's a great segue into talk about tourism.
Yeah.
So what about our bread and butter tourism? So concerning sports, does the population forecast tell us anything about where that is going and how it will continue to grow?
Well, the tourism number is you might say an addition to our population. That is, if you have 42 million visitors, they're spaced out over the year, and they're spending 3 or 4 days on the strip. It's like you're adding 400,000 people every day for the entire year. So our population is more than just the local residents. The local residents plus the visitors. So the visitors are all demanding many of the same services the local residents are. They need the transportation system. They need all the fun things that they do on the strip, off the strip. Some people actually come here to go outside the city and partake of the hiking and trails that we have that are very close to Las Vegas. So that the population forecast tells us how those activities are going to grow over time, not only for domestic residents of the city, but also for the visitors. And the most recent event that's taken place is the emergence of sports entertainment as a key to visitors in Las Vegas. We just had an event this week on esports, and although we learned it was not as big as the Super Bowl, it was a large group of people, and we had our event down at the Luxor in their very nice esports room.
Yeah, the model right now says that essentially from an employment standpoint, leisure and hospitality continue to grow, and it will be grow by about 14% in terms of total employment. So 14% more workforce than it is today. It's still down as of today, though, pre-pandemic levels of employment, and some of that has come through efficiencies, but also some of the labor shortages in that industry. We in terms of the number of visitors coming here, we do have a forecast on that. Is it 60 million is by 2040? Though
But we disagree on that.
yeah, there's some
I'm thinking
disagreement.
more 50 million.
Yeah, so maybe more 50 million. And at the same time, in terms of the short term, our record was around 42, a little over 42 million pre-pandemic. We're seeing in the next they'll take another 2 years or so before we get quite to there. And some of that is just a change in nature of who is visiting here. I'm really watching not so much about visitations, but conventions. Are they coming back, and the nature of conventions and that value add for companies to come here and visit here, and that Monday through Thursday traffic and how that's adding. But certainly there's no doubt that sports has been really helpful to strengthening and maturing in an industry that's been maturing. The fact that the Raiders Stadium or Allegiant Stadium is sold out on numerous occasions for concerts to football games is good news for us, and we think that continues. But it's
With a large percentage of of visitors being the buyers of tickets, and not necessarily domestic,
Yeah.
residents of the city.
which is what they wanted, right? I mean, so it's been good, but at the same time, in the long run, we also need to think about these other industries too. And it's not a and or it's not an or, it's an and in terms of like as we also grow leisure and hospitality, we can grow healthcare and we can grow manufacturing too.
Till recently, the two factors that were sort of missing from our visitor volume were foreign visitors and convention business. And Andrew mentioned conventions. The issue there, I think, is because of the pandemic and the move towards online communication. The question is, will the convention business be as big as it was in the past because of the option of having a virtual convention as opposed to face to face? Of course, if you go to Vegas, where else can you have all the fun and other things to do? Go to Chicago, go to LA. Okay, well, let's go to Vegas. Maybe Vegas can survive that as well and come back at the same level and maybe even stronger in the convention business.
Yeah, it'll be interesting, and this is not something we forecast, but something we've read about and talked about is the nature of employment for people with their employer. And so, yeah, you might be able to do your Monday morning meeting virtually, but if you want to build a team, you might need to get together every now and then. And I think potentially as a value proposition, coming to Vegas and having a good time, but also learning from one another and working together, it might be part of that value proposition.
Now, I know there are differences between sort of your predictions on what the future visitor counts might be, but we're talking 50 million or 60 million visitors. Will we have the capacity, or how do you foresee that unfolding?
Well, that's a good question. Once again, it comes back to Las Vegas and the choke points about I-15, the airport, and how much additional capacity do we have at the airport to bring people in? Currently, it also has freight coming in. And then the question is, well, what about an airport down near Jean, the Ivanpah Airport, which could handle freight? Of course, you talk about a new airport, that's not going to happen today or tomorrow. It's going to be years away. So once again, it's planning for the long run.
And we do know, and you can see this in our report, and again, CBER.unlv.edu in the population forecast. We do, see about a little under 7,000 more hotel rooms coming online in the next 2 years. So we're still growing in terms of number of hotel rooms, which were a little above 150,000 is the last count from the LVCVA. But so it's, as Steve likes to say, it'll be driven by the private sector to a large degree, but the infrastructure we've got to.
Well, I harken back to the pre-Great Recession when the Las Vegas was booming and the room rates on the weekends were so high, everybody and his brother was saying, hey, we need more hotel rooms.
Mhm.
Of course, and this is a situation where you might call market failure, that everybody is making their own decision and there's no coordination.
Yep.
So at one point, there was plans for about 45,000 new rooms in Vegas on a base of 150,000. You look back on it and say, was that crazy or not? Well, we see that we had some empty buildings that were built, and anyway, the Great Recession sort of put the kibosh on all those additional rooms. We're still around just over 150,000 rooms.
And I know when we talk about just the volume of visitors, we talk about, increasing to over 3 million plus people living here. Are we going to end up in a situation where it's too expensive to actually live in Southern Nevada? As we talk about cost of living.
Just keep in mind California. We're always going to be cheaper than California. I guarantee that. Now, the problem is,
Will wages
problem
keep
of
pace?
some of the workers here in Las Vegas may be unable to live here. That's what your concern is.
And that's where when we talk about workforce earlier, diversifying the economy, if we're intentional about where we kind of want the workforce to go, these jobs that pay more than just $20 an hour, but could pay $40 an hour, are really important. And again, they don't necessarily require a college degree. And we see this in different industries, as I mentioned earlier, healthcare, manufacturing, trade, transportation, warehousing. But we have to be intentional about training those workers and giving them the skills so that they can have those kind of jobs. Because relatively speaking, as Steve is making the point here, like compared to LA, will still be cheaper in Phoenix and Salt Lake maybe. But compared to what we've been to in the past and what is the average wage in town, which is roughly for an individual in town, is roughly about $35,000, $38,000. That's not sustainable when you have housing prices that are, over $500,000 for a new home.
Then could you speak to how inflation factors into the model?
It doesn't necessarily factor into the model, but we do want to talk about inflation. So I mean, is this here on the screen? That's PCE inflation. So it's one of the ways that inflation is measured, and we all know that this has been top and center of our news cycle for months now. And Steve and I have been talking about this in the public for I think over a year now. For the next, so it shows up there. So headline inflation 6.8%. This is PCE. And then core, so minus food and energy, is 4.8%. And then your trim mean is 4.3%. And we know that.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, please.
Okay. The headline inflation is the CPI, Consumer Price Index. And that I like to view that as a micro concept because it's based on what a average household of four would buy in an urban setting. And they calculate a basket, and then over time the prices change and they adjust, and that's how they get that index. The PCE is what the Fed follows. It's the personal consumption expenditure. It comes out of the calculation of GDP. So it's a macro concept. It looks at the whole consumption pattern of the whole country. So it's macro. The CPI is just looking at the consumption of an individual household and sort of generalizes that to all households. So that there are different concepts and they tend to move together. But right now the CPI it peaked at 9.1% and now it's at 8.5%. And that's what most people are familiar with because that's what the press comes up. The press always comes up with, if you're talking about bad news, they come up with the worst news. Okay? The PCE is not quite as high. It's as you can see there, 6.8% for the PCE and the core PCE. Now, what is the core PCE? You take out food and energy. They tend to be rather volatile components. The Fed is interested in controlling the trend inflation rate, not so much the cycles around the trend. So the core takes out the food and energy, and you see it's 4.8%. The average person sitting on their couch watching this would say, what's he talking about, 4.8%? The gasoline, my goodness, it's really been expensive. The trim mean is, well, I won't even go there. That's the economists.
Now, what do you think is going to happen in terms of inflation
It's going to come
over the
down.
course of the next few months, a year?
It's going to come down. It's not going to come down too quickly. The Fed is working furiously trying to get the inflation rate down, and they've jacked up interest rates at 75 basis points the last time they saw, or 0.75% the last time they met. And the anticipation they'll do the same thing in September, the next time they meet. The good news is the labor market is really still rather strong. And that's given the Fed the opportunity to put the brakes on inflation without causing a recession. Well, we'll have to see. We're going to talk about that later, maybe if we have time.
Yeah, and just to add on to Steve's comments, so the labor market, we just got numbers today on weekly new filings for unemployment, continues to show very strong job market. I think the latest number I heard nationally is something like around 6 million job gap between jobs in demand and workers looking for jobs, seeking jobs. And that's a huge gap. A lot of that is being driven, part of this worker shortage is that you have about 3 million less workers in the workforce. A lot of that could be because of retirements that happened during the pandemic, and there's been some research out of Brookings that's shown some of that. And so the Fed is looking at how do we essentially slow down the economy enough without tipping into recession so that that gap reduces itself, so that 6 million comes down. And if I'm the Fed right now, I'm a little concerned because you still have a very hot job market. We saw in July, the amount of jobs added was way above, it was over 500,000, was way above what was predicted. And that, is continuing to kind of drive inflation in terms of demand. At the same time, you want to watch consumer spending, which is the figure I've been watching and very much attentive to, which is essentially still slowly going up. And we've gotten some new data yesterday on this as well on retail sales, but at the same time, like how do consumers continue to have this spending power going into the fall that they've had? Are they still willing to pay high prices? At some point, you want them to give up and say, I'm going to stop spending this much money on certain things. And you can see things like substitution where they're shopping for, instead of buying organic eggs, they're just buying normal eggs, right, at the grocery store to save money. And you see some of that, which is, you have to kind of cool down the economy in order for inflation to come down. But at the same time, that also potentially means you tip up unemployment. That's the trade-off. As Steve and I described it, it's like trying to land for the Fed right now. It's like trying to land a fighter jet on an aircraft carrier in the middle of a bit of a storm. They have a hard job because the interest rates are very effective tools at bringing down inflation. And it does take them about 6 months to a year to really get their full effect. And we've only just started raising rates in March. So like if they continue to raise rates, do they overdo it because they don't know what the future holds, because the impact from higher rates will take some time to weave its way into the economy.
At the same time, also positive news is that the balance sheets of households and businesses, both of them are in reasonably good shape. And the banking system is very well capitalized, so we don't have any financial fragility out there at the moment. And we hope.
Yeah.
We hope. We can always hope.
Yeah.
Hope is good.
Well, I lost the.
Did I lose your train of thought on this?
You lost
Yeah.
my train of thought by saying hope. Okay.
Well, and I think his point is essentially that, so the banking system, the consumers, we're in a much different place than 2008.
I forgot the negative point.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, consumer sentiment is in the toilet, so to speak.
So as we sort of talk about fears of the consumers and nationally, what would you say to those who are concerned about a recession?
Well, the problem is, it's been equipped by Ronald Reagan and by Harry Truman. Both of them are reputed to have said this, that unemployment is when my neighbor's out of work, and depression is when I'm out of work. So if you're employed, things are looking pretty good. Well, okay, there's inflation, but the prices of gasoline is coming down. That's a nice signal. But if you're unemployed, you're saying things are not looking so good. So it depends on your current employment situation. And as Andrew said, and as I said, the labor market is still pretty strong. I wouldn't say hot, but it's still pretty strong with all the excess jobs in the market.
Yeah, and there's a bit of psychology on this, right? Which again, this is why the Fed is walking such a tight rope on this, is that if we keep saying the word recession, it tends to get into consumers' psychology, and then when suddenly we are in a recession, it's like you say it enough times, it comes true. And
if consumers stop spending
Yes.
and demand goes down, then we actually have a recession.
which we haven't seen.
Self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah. But we have seen, as Steve pointed out, the consumer sentiment is at an all-time low. It did nudge a little bit higher this past month, which was interesting. And I think a lot of that is just the psychology. Inflation is very, there's a big psychological effect on consumers. When you are paying double to fill up your car every day for gas, and suddenly your grocery bill is doubled, even if you've gotten a pay raise, is we've got data and we've shown on presentations, real wages, so basically the wage that you were receiving if you've gotten a pay increase this in the last year versus what inflation has been, you're still in the negative. It's not keeping up with inflation. Now, there are some consequences if it were to keep up with inflation in terms of creating more inflation, but there is, at the same time, as a consumer, you may feel a little bit richer because you've gotten a pay raise, but then when you go to spend it, you're suddenly like, well, it's suddenly my grocery bill, my gas bill, my going out to eat, my hotel bill everything is way more.
I know you shared a lot of different factors. So based on everything you know right now, on a scale of 1 to 10,
Yeah.
1 being a chance, 10 being an absolute, what do you think the chances of a recession happening are?
I'd say 30%, 3, I guess. Did I get that right?
1 being no chance, 10 being
Yeah,
absolute.
3.
What about you, Andrew?
Well, before I answer, I did want to show, because I think it was up there, our leading index. So this is something that we produce, and this is on our website, and we do this every month, and we put this in our newsletter, Rebel Business Indicators, which you can sign up for at CBER.unlv.edu. This is our recession predictor. So I'm going to give you an answer, but I just want to say too, for the public, we have a predictor of recessions. This is about a leading index for Southern Nevada. It forecasts about 6 to 12 months ahead of time. And when it stagnates, essentially when that line goes horizontal or declines, that's when a recession happens, which those gray bars indicate recessions. Pandemic's a little different because it's really hard to forecast pandemic that's based on health, on an issue with health and not economic conditions. But the last 2 months, the indicator has gone down, and you think we needed a couple more months to see that. Certainly all right, to answer your question, I think in terms of a cooling, so I'm copying out here a little bit, is easily about a 7 to 8 out of 10. I think a recession is more about a 3 or a 4. We certainly see, I think it's going to be interesting to watch retail numbers this fall, and do consumers through the holiday season have the spending power that they've had through the summer, and that continues. And then particularly as we get through the holidays and we go into early next year, do consumers just kind of call it quits for a little bit, and does that cool the economy into a recession? And I think that's where we see in our forecasts and our data, which you can find out more on our website, and you can sign up for our subscription. That's where we see the weakness in the U.S. economy is early next year.
And then
So let me just add to that. So there are 2 measures of recession. One is the headline measure, which is 2 down quarters of GDP. We're already in recession, according to that, until the revision in the GDP number, which is going to come out later this month. It could be that 0.9% decrease turns into a 0.3% increase, and then we're not in recession. Or you can wait on the National Bureau of Economic Research Business Cycle Dating Committee, those poobahs who meet, and they look at a lot of data, including the labor market, and my suspicion is they would not call a recession at the moment. In fact, they usually call recessions about 12 months after they occur, because the data don't come in.
Right.
well, let me get you out of here on this last question.
Yeah.
Let's end today on a high note. What is one thing that you are encouraged by right now?
Well, I've already said it, the labor market and the balance sheets, the financial position of the whole economy.
And what about you, Andrew?
I think consumer spending, just seeing how resilient the consumer has been through the summer has been really encouraging, and how as much as it is a tough job market, it's still, if you're a worker out there looking for work, it's a great time to be looking for a job, and we see that companies are still hiring, and that gives me a positive feeling right now. Ask me in 6 months, and we'll see where we're at on that one.
So Keith, what do you say?
I'm gonna leave it to the experts. I'm gonna punt.
Yeah.
Well, we're out of time. Thank you to CBER for having me today. You have shared some really interesting information. I hope the viewers agree as well. We would love your feedback on today's event, and we will be sending out a survey in the next few days. In the meantime, visit the CBER website at cber.unlv.edu for more data and information, including more information about the population forecast.
Thank you.